Well, it's another warm welcome back, all my loyal YouTube friends, and thanks to you all once more for tuning in to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, in this next video presentation, I've uncovered another vintage motocross classic that just recently resurfaced after many years in storage in a motor museum. So for the next few minutes, I hope you'll stay with me as we take a look around a 1974 Cheney Aberg BSA 500. Now, the particular story surrounding this fantastic looking motorcycle is not that comprehensive, and I can only tell you what I know, and some of the details are a bit sketchy, but nevertheless apparently they are all true. But firstly, the bike is without doubt a genuine 1974 Cheney Aberg BSA 500, and this bike was built by Erik Cheney himself and was destined to be ridden by Swedish motocross star Bengt Aberg. Now, whether Aberg actually rode this bike is a bit unclear, although the word is that the bike was commissioned and purchased by Aberg's sponsors in 1974, and then shortly after, for reasons unknown, was then placed into a Swedish motor museum alongside some old classic cars. But this bike now belongs to Scottish rider Stewart Roden. Now, Stewart had heard that this bike was being offered for sale through one of his contacts in the motor trade, as a few of the classic cars in this particular museum were also being auctioned off, and naturally Stewart was interested in this bike and bought it immediately to add to his collection of classic CCM bikes. But this bike is definitely the real deal, with that fantastic handmade Erik Cheney frame and that big 500cc BSA B50 motor. Now, with regards to this particular 500cc BSA engine, I'm not sure about its internals with regards any tuning or upgrades that have been done, although, as well you know, even in their standard configuration, these big long stroking 4-stroke BSA engines are still fast enough for your average classic rider. But my guess is that if this bike was ridden or intended to be ridden by Aberg, I doubt very much if it would have had a set of stock internals inside these casings. But the workmanship on this nickel plated frame and this BSA engine is just astounding, and you can see how they've welded the footrest mount here and brake pedal anchor to the side of the clutch casing and left a hole in the centre so that you can remove the centre plug and adjust the clutch without removing that bracket. And of course, these bikes also had folding footrests and a simple cable operated rear brake, but it's all good engineering and just one of the many things that make this bike very special. And as far as old classic dirt bikes go, this little bike is one of the nicest that I've certainly come across in 2020. Now, a nice short gear lever on this BSA, although I'm not sure what the initials MCE are referring to in this instance, but this could be just a manufacturer's mark. Now, the Kickstarter is another little innovation on this bike, because rather than the top section just folding parallel with the right hand side of the bike, actually folds completely into the inside of the bike, tucking it out of harm's way. But it's certainly a big lump of a motor, this BSA engine, and you can only imagine what this bike sounds like through that big bore exhaust system. And in fact, Stewart told me that he's never even fired the bike up since he bought it, and says he just can't bring himself to do it in case he damages something in the process, because it's such a special little motorcycle. Although, to be fair to Stewart, he's had absolutely no reason to start her up, as there's been no classic racing whatsoever in Scotland since October 2019, which is now getting on to almost a full year ago. But who knows, maybe 2021 will bring better days and we might see Stewart ripping around the racetrack on this beautiful bike next year. Anyhow, in this particular shot you get a better view of that folding Kickstarter that we were talking about earlier on. Now, another unique part of this Cheney frame is the way that the swing arm is fixed to the back of the chassis. Now, rather than having a long spindle that goes right through the frame, it's held on by a bolt and nut on each side of the swing arm mount. And one of the other little innovations on the swing arm is that rather than having the front mounting sitting inside the rear of the chassis, the swing arm mount is actually divided into two separate lugs that fit on either side of the frame. Now, this kind of fixing is very unusual on a classic dirt bike frame, but I suppose not for one of these very high quality Cheney made chassis. Now, the bike's front suspension system has a pair of forks straight from another iconic British made dirt racer, the HIS Stormer. Now, these Stormer suspension systems were very good units for 1974 and were very successful when fitted to those HIS machines, so that's possibly why Eric Cheney has used them on this Aberg BSA bike. Now, the front brake hub on this Cheney BSA is a genuine Rickman hub. Now, these parts are very rare and not really that easy to come by these days, but they are excellent quality and very light, naturally because they're made of alloy, and surprisingly enough they did provide decent stopping power for an older style drum brake system. Now, the rear hub again is another Rickman part, and these are even rarer than the front hubs, but as you can see, when they're sitting in this lovely Cheney hand-built chassis, they certainly look the goods. Now, quite a nice pair of chain adjusters on this Cheney frame, and they do look easy enough to work on. You just slacken off the rear axle nut and then reposition this cam plate to tension the rear drive chain. But this business end of the bike looks quite intimidating with that quite large rear drive sprocket and that heavy duty brake anchor rod on the bottom, which again is fully adjustable. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a genuine cast alloy Rickman brake back plate on this Cheney BSA, because as well you know, when Eric Cheney puts a bike together, he always tried to use the best parts that he could lay his hands on at the time, and these Rickman items were about as good as you could get for 1974. Now, the exhaust system is a straight through big bore pipe with no silencer or muffler fitted, so you can only imagine what this lovely motor sounds like when it bursts into life. Now, the header pipe came out of the motor's barrel and then crossed in front of the frame down tube and exited here just underneath the chassis, and because there was no silencer, it kept the overall weight of the bike down to a minimum, plus it made it sound fantastic. Now, the rear shocks on this bike are a pair of the parts that I'm not entirely sure of. Now, they don't look to me like period correct suspension units from 1974. They'll look more like a pair of classic Olin shocks, but then again, what do I know? But they certainly look the goods, and who knows, Stewart may still have the original shocks in his possession. But I must admit, one of the nicer parts on this bike is this lovely alloy tank, which of course is painted in this fine metallic blue colour. Now this tank would have held more than enough fuel for a lengthy moto race, although having said that, I still don't know if that B50 motocross BSA motor was actually set up to run on methanol or just regular gas, as many of these exotic B50 engines did use methanol back in the day instead of petrol, because it made the engine run cooler, it produced much more power, and of course almost eliminated any of that pinking that you used to get using regular leaded fuels. Now this bike's seat maybe not look the most comfortable for an old classic motocross bike, but then again, guys didn't fly around bumpy racetracks back in the day with these old crossers to try and be comfortable in the process, because much of their time the rider would have spent standing on the footrests, because let's face it, the suspension systems on these bikes were not fantastic for 1974. But nevertheless, despite that, it looks an easy enough part to remove in a hurry with just a couple of these Allen bolts either side of the frame to unscrew to remove it from the bike. But once again, it's good to see an old vintage off-road race bike with some nice shiny old school alloy mudguards, as so many of these classic dirt bikes these days tend to opt for plastic parts, naturally because they're cheaper and more durable, but I still think these old bikes look great with these alloy mudguards and their metal side panels. Now on our particular Cheney BSA bike, it's still sporting its original 1974 Spanish-made Morad alloy wheels. Now these again are not that easy to come by in these modern times, and the pair of wheels on this Cheney are in fantastic condition for a bike that's now 46 years old. And of course, not only that, the bike still has its original Trelleborg tyres on the front and back, so that again is another very rare sight. Now, although there is one part that's not correct on this bike, and it's these Renthal handlebars. Now, if you know your Cheney race bikes, you'll know that Cheney's handlebars had a welded crossbar that came down at an angle and joined to the bottom of the bar in between these two bar clamps. Now, what actually happened to the bike's original bars is we don't know, and this was just how Stewart found the bike when he first purchased it. But it would have been nice to still have the original bars fitted to this lovely little bike. Now, the rest of the bike's controls, including the levers, the grips and the cables, are all still the factory 1974 parts, and what's more, they're all still in remarkable condition, which is not surprising really when you know that the bike's been languishing in a Swedish museum for the best part of its life. But nevertheless, and despite this bike having the wrong handlebars fitted, you have to admit that this is still a cracking looking old vintage scrambler. And with it having that hand-built Eric Cheney frame and that stonking BSA B50 motor, and of course the connection with the great Swedish legend Bengt Aberg, this is a lovely piece of motocross racing history, and certainly one of the nicest old classic race bikes that I've come across so far this year. And so there you have it. I do hope you've enjoyed this little trip around Stewart Roden's latest addition to his vintage bike collection. That's his 1974 Cheney BSA Aberg race bike. Now don't forget, if these are the kind of motorcycles that you like to look at here on YouTube, then please hit that subscribe button to see more of these long lost pieces of vintage iron. But once again, thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you all very soon, right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.